Hello there, welcome to the continuation of our JavaScript tutorial. Today's video, we're gonna be looking at the JavaScript looping functions, the looping statements. We have two major looping statements in JavaScript, the for loop and the while loop. The for loop in general can execute a block of code over a number of times. So loops are handy if you want to run the same code over and over again, each time with a different value. So now look at it. These are problems that gave rise to, creation of loop, something like this. Now, this is an array, right? And you want to access each and every one elements of the array. Of course, if the array contains maybe 3 elements, it's easier. You say cars of 0, first element, cars of 1, second element, cars of 2, third element, right? But what if this array cars contains maybe a list of 100 cars? Do you have to write cars of 0 up to cars of 99? So it becomes very difficult, and so situations like this warrants that you use the for statement. So even if the array contains thousands of lists, with these 3 or 4 lines of code, you can what? You can go through the entire elements of the array. Now look at this. So this is just an example, a simple example of a for loop. When you declare a variable, say I, the for loop starts with the keyword for. Then in opening and closing bracket, it has 3 other statements. This is the first statement, ended with a semicolon. Then another conditional statement ended with a semicolon, and the last statement here. Because it's the last statement, you must not necessarily put a semicolon here. Then we now have the block of code to be executed over a number of times. Now, how the for loop works is that it has an initialized variable set to 0. Since you want to be able to access the index of the array starting from 0, so you have an initialized variable statement here set to 0. Then you have a conditional statement of which, in as much as this condition is true, the loops keeps running, right? Then you have the third statement that tends to increment your counter. So this variable I is known as the counter. Then you have the last statement that is being executed upon every completion of a cycle, right? So every time the loop completes a cycle, it executes this code. Every time it completes a cycle, it executes this code. Now, if you take a look at this condition here, I less than cars.length. So now let's assume cars has 5 items. That means cars.length will return 5, right? Okay, so an I is initially 0. So it means the condition that will be checked here is that 0 less than 5, right? Now, which is true. So therefore, this code will be executed, text plus cars of 0. So it will pick the first car in the array and then append it to text. Then upon completion of this cycle, this code will be executed, and so that means that I will jump from 0 to what? To 1. And so it keeps on going. Now, if the cars contain 5 elements, upon completion of the cars of 4, sorry, when I is 4, then it will increment this I to 5, and then this condition becomes what? False. And so if the condition becomes false, the loop is terminated. So that's how for loop. Different kinds of loop. So we have the for loop through a block of code a number of times. The for in loop through properties of an object. The while loops through a block of code while a specified condition is true. Do while also loop through a block of code while a specified condition is true. So we're going to be looking at all these for different looping statements. The for loop has the following syntax. So statement 1 is executed one time. So it is executed only once before the execution of the code block. Now, statement 2 defines the condition for executing the code block. So this is a conditional statement, in otherwise a Boolean expression. So in as much as this expression is true, then it keeps what? Running the loop. Now, statement 3 is executed every time after the code block has been executed. So for example, this if you run this one now, then the end result is gonna be, you can see we said this, the number is, then break. So the number is, I started from 0, so we have 0, then I becomes what? Becomes 1. It stopped at 4 because you say I less than 5. Because if I becomes 5, it will stop the loop. Why? Because 5 isn't less than 5. 5 equals 5. But if I had say less than or equal to like this, and I run the program, you see it will include 5, right? It will include 5. But since I said strictly less than like this, then once 5 becomes I becomes equal to 5, then it stops. So it doesn't go further, right? Okay, so normally you will use statement 1 to initialize the variable used in the loop, that is I. This is not always the case. JavaScript doesn't care. Statement 1 is optional. You can initiate many values in statement 1. So look at this example here. For I equals 0, len is equals to cast.length, text is equals to empty, I less than len, then I plus plus. So it's just the same thing. Here we initialize several variables in the what? In the loop. So now, if you look at it, we created a new variable called len, and then we assign the length of the array cast to it. Then we also initialize our text to become an empty text, and then we now bring in a condition. Then our increment statement. So more or less the same. It's just a simple way of doing it this way, right? So it's like a short form of this, right? Statement 2. Often statement 2 is used to evaluate the condition of the initial variable. This is not always the case. JavaScript doesn't care. Statement 2 is also optional. So if statement 2 returns true, the loop starts over again. So it means that if you decide to run the loop and maybe use a different condition to end statement 2, is also possible, right? So if statement 2 returns true, the loop will start over again. If statement 2 returns false, the loop will end, right? So if you omit statement 2, you must provide a break inside the loop. Otherwise, the loop will never end. This will crash your browser. Read about breaks in the next. So in as much as you are not going to specify a condition, a stopping condition, which is this, right? Then you must have a condition inside the code block to stop the loop. Otherwise, you end up in an unending loop, infinite loop. Okay, Statement 3. Often statement 3 increments the value of the initial variable. This is not always the case. JavaScript doesn't care. And statement 3 is optional. Statement 3 can do anything like negative increment, positive increment, or even increment. Instead of incrementing by 1, you can choose to increment by, you know, a large number or anything else. Statement 3 can be omitted like in the increment, like when you increment your value inside the loop. So for example, you have something like this, say I is this, then you now have I less than length, and then you decide to increment your I inside the loop. So this also possible. Okay, now the for in loop. The for in statement loops through properties of an object. So we've seen how to loop through an array. The next thing is that how do we loop through, this object? So the for in loops through the properties of this. So you say for x in person. So x in person loops through the property of what? The property of this object, so that x will now start having things like the properties, which is the f name, the l name, and the age, for example. So if I say variable text is empty, x is the variable x, then x in person. Now x will start looping through the properties of this object. So x will become f name the first time, then the loop goes. Then next time it goes to the next property, l name, then the loop goes. Then it goes to the next property, age, then the loop goes. Then if the properties are done, if there are no more properties, then the loop stops. So that's very, 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 nice. So for example, if you run through this, you now have text is empty, we have the passing object, we have x declared, then we have for x in person, text plus equal person of x. So person of x will give you, for example, if I say person of f name, it will give me John, right? Then if I say person of L name, it will give me Do. And if I say person of age, it will give me 25. So the property is age and the value is 25. So if I say person of the property, it gives me. Another thing I can do, instead of using the square bracket, I can choose to use the dot notation like this, which also gives the same undefined. Okay, so it's better to stick with what the square notation like this. Okay, good. Then we have the while loop. The while loop and the do while loop will be explained in the next chapter. Now, the while loop. The while loop loops through a block of code as long as a specified condition is true. So that is the syntax of a while loop. Very simple and straightforward. In as much as you have a condition and the condition remains true, then the while loop keeps looping. Now, if you look at this example, here we said while I is less than 10, text plus the number is I. Now, what that means is that we must have initialized I to maybe 0, right? And then we have an increment here. Now, if you omit this increment here, then the I will never move from that 0, and the loop will always be an infinite loop. Because if we keep incrementing I, then it means that I will get to a condition that it will get to a value that this condition becomes what? A false, right? And so at that point, the loop will come to an end. So for example, if we run this, you can see we initialize our I to 0 while I is less than 10. We keep going, right? Again, if I add the equal sign here, that means I can be less or equal to 10. So if I gets to 10, then it's still going to run the loop one more time until I gets to 11. Then it will stop the loop, because 11 is actually greater than 10. It's not less than or equal to 10. Okay, if you forget to increase the variable used in the condition, the loop will never end. This will crash your browser. Now the do while loop. The do while loop is a variant of the while loop. This loop will execute the block of code once before checking if the condition is true. Then it will repeat the loop as long as the condition is true. So for example, you say do, so the do while is executes the block of code first. So it starts from by executing the block of code first only one time. Then it gets to the while condition, so that's when it now checks the condition to see if it's true. So look at this example here. We have initialized our I to what? To 0, and then we say do, then we bring our block of code, and then we say text plus equal, the number is this, I plus plus, then we now check our condition. So again, it's the same thing. If I add the equal sign here, again, it gives me up to 10. Okay. Comparing for and while. If you have read the previous chapter about the for loop, you will discover that a while loop is much the same as for loop, with statement 1 and statement 3 omitted. Yeah, the loop is, in this example, used a for loop. So if you look at this, it's not too different from the while loop, right? While this one is the while loop. So we have an array of cars, and then we have our I set to 0, our text set to an empty variable, and then we have the for. We already have our I initialized, so we say semicolon, then we say cars of I, then we say text plus equal cars of I, then I plus plus. So our condition is that an I must exist, right? So if I becomes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, cast of I becomes a false. So because that particular index doesn't exist, so it returns a false. This is our condition, stopping condition, and then the loop comes to an end. Again, while cast of I, text plus equal this, again, this is what? The same example using the while loop. So briefly, we're gonna be talking about the break statement, and we're gonna stop here. We're gonna do our practicals, start with our practical next week, where we build a real web application using JavaScript. So JavaScript is not the only technology to use when building a web application, but it's there to what? To optimize your web application. So we're going to be looking at two statements here. We're going to be looking at the break statement and the continue statement. We already come across these statements in previous chapters, especially the break. We came across the break in the switch statement, where we used it to what? To jump out of the loop. So the difference between the break and continue is that the break statement jumps out of the loop, while the continue statement jumps over one iteration, right? So, for example, the break statement. So, look at this example here. we are looping from 0 to 10, right? But look at this condition here now. Says if I is equal to 3 brick. So what this is gonna do is that once I becomes 3, then it's going to what? Stop the loop entirely. So in that case, we only have the loop to have run for I is 0, I1, and I is 2. So when I becomes 3 and it gets to this line, that's where it's gonna say, oh, I is 3 now, so I'm gonna execute this code here. I'm just gonna stop. All right. So that's how the break statement works. It helps you to what? To jump or to stop the loop or to terminate the loop. Now, however, the continue statement, look at how the continue statement works. It only breaks it only stops one of the iterations. So in this case here, instead of, when it comes across this continue statement, instead of printing for I3, it's going to just stop at this point and then goes for the next iteration, which is what? I is equals to 4. So continue only breaks that particular iteration. So the next iteration is supposed to be 4, right? Because obviously it's going to increment I from 3 to 4. And so you won't see that of 3, but it continues from 4 because it actually skipped, that of 3 because of the continue statement. So look at our output. We have 0, 1, 2. When it got to 3, it what? It terminates the iteration at that point and continued. So that's why we have the 4, the 5, the 6, and up to 9. So that's how the continue statement works. So the JavaScript labels. To label JavaScript statement, you precede the statement with a label and a semicolon. So, for example, label, then statements. The break and continue statements are only JavaScript statements that can jump out of a code block. Syntax: break, label, continue, label. So, the continue statement with or without a label reference can only be used to skip one loop iteration. The break statement without a label reference can only be used to jump out of the loop or a switch. With a label reference, the break statement can be used to jump out of any code block. So for example, now you have a car, an array of cars, and then you created a label here, say list, and then you set it to a code block. Now you say text plus equal car of 0, car of 1, then you say break list, and then it will end up in that it's gonna stop at that point. Okay, so a break used to also terminate what? It's also used to terminate a label, right? Or it's used to jump out of a code block. So see you in our next video. We're gonna come up with a practical problem where we're gonna put all the foundations we've laid on JavaScript into what? Into practical use. All what we've learned so far, the syntax, the comment, the variable operators, arithmetic functions, object, events, the difference, predefined number functions, array functions, dates, and the rest. We're gonna put them to use in that practical example. So see you guys in the next video.